we all know that Expedition 33 is not Game of the Year, that the Game Awards is a sham, and that Jeff Keighley cannot be trusted to do anything in regards for the players. Okay. We all know that this was a complete farce and that in actuality, Nintendo won this year. The Switch 2 won, and Donkey Kong Bonanza won, Mario Kart World won, Kirby Air Riders won, Metroid Prime 4 won. Like, it was shocking watching this show and like seeing like, best art direction. Like, well, that should be Metroid Prime 4. Nope, Expedition 33. It's Unreal Engine 5 slop. The most generic, boring looking game you could imagine with its stiff animations, its terrible character models, and it's awful, awful environmental design. Expedition 33 is just a very good example of just how desperate the industry is to keep up the illusion that the Western video game world is relevant, right? We were seeing like this game be given all these awards that it did not deserve. Best soundtrack should have gotten a Pokemon Legends. Or Mario Kart World, or like, it was really strange, like watching these awards and not even seeing the better Nintendo games even get nominated. It was very, very embarrassing. But what really struck me about this, really, and a lot of people have noticed this now too, is that Expedition 33 won Best Indie Game. It's not indie. It has a publisher. It received financing from investors. So by definition, Expedition 33 is not indie. Like you keep seeing people say this, like, well, they're not owned by anybody, and so that means that they're independent. No, you idiot. Like independent means independently financed. That you pay for everything out of pocket with no investors at all. Like the entire hope that this is indie falls flat on its face the instant you really start looking into the background of this game and how it was produced, how it was funded. The entire narrative that you see people like come up with, like it only cost $10 million to produce. Like it's not true. Like it just isn't. And it's really, really remarkable to see just how many people are willing to dispute this point. Like, they really want you to believe that this low budget slop should be classified as indie to make it look better than all the other indie games and more affordable than the AAA slop, Like, that's kind of what this is all about, is that we are seeing, like, an attempt at, like, infiltrating the indie scene from corporate interests to try and rebrand indie as just meaning, like, low budget. That's essentially what we're seeing, is that we're seeing games being sold to you that you would not buy if you knew that they were coming from major corporations. Instead, they're doing this thing where they're trying to say that, like, oh, we don't have a lot of money and we put all our heart and souls inside of it, and that's why it deserves to be Game of the Year, even though that there were better Nintendo games out this year. Like, this has been happening a lot. And like right now we're just supposed to accept it. We're just supposed to accept that this should be classified as an indie game in spite of the millions of dollars put into its development. It's ridiculous. It is positively like absurd, the lengths that people will go to keep the narrative alive, because like the AAA scene has collapsed. That's the simple reality of it, is that the Final Fantasy VII like tactic of like hyping up some random RPG as like the greatest of all time and how Nintendo could never compete and how like Final Fantasy was way bigger than Zelda, that doesn't work anymore. Like it's kind of remarkable, looking at like the decline of Final Fantasy and its fall from grace, and like how just so much of it kind of hinged on this idea that they gaslit people into thinking the game was more impressive than it really was. Right. And that, of course, extends to games like Metal Gear Solid and like, Jak and Daxter and like, all these, like, Grand Theft Auto, like the list goes on and on. But like what's happened is eventually graphics stopped getting better. they stopped evolving. They started getting ludicrously expensive to produce, and they take longer and longer and longer. And now we're waiting 13 years for a Grand Theft Auto 6. So the entire narrative has to become that, like, well, now we want like lower budget, artsier games. Let's ignore all the Nintendo games that were already doing that, but let's hype up this random French studio instead. That's essentially what we're seeing, is that we are seeing the narrative shift. Nintendo has beaten the AAA industry. They are completely irrelevant at this point. And now they're trying to like prop up some random studio to defeat Nintendo. And like it's just the same old song and dance. And I think it's something that's going to perpetually continue until the Game Awards just doesn't exist anymore. But like the issue with this, and I do think this is like a new thing that we haven't really seen before, is that like because of this new tactic, they have to do this thing in order to legitimize this lower budget game. They have to give it all these awards. They have to give it all this hype. They have to nominate it for categories that it did not earn, right? They have to do all of this stuff. And what happens inevitably is that they shaft other games that they should be supporting. So with this game, because the Expedition 33 getting promoted so hard to try and legitimize it, Hades 2, Silksong, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 especially have all been like made completely irrelevant. Like nobody is going to remember those games now. Silksong's L here, I think, is going to be the next major step in getting that game to be discredited in the community. And that was something that people were seriously hyping up as the Metroid killer for a good long while there. And like this is a very good example of why that isn't going to happen. Hollow Knight was one of the most successful indie games made in recent years, and within like a release of the sequel, it's been rendered almost completely irrelevant. It really demonstrates, I think, how something like Metroid Prime 4, which was way more controversial, which had all this weird development cycle, and like a lot of people were damage controlling when it came out, like it's remarkable how this like goated indie game like gets completely positively wrecked by Nintendo simply because they can't afford to do what Nintendo does. They can't afford to take time with it. They can't afford to experiment. They can't afford to take risks. And they certainly can't afford to put out multiple games a generation the way Metroid has. And Metroid is one of Nintendo's smallest franchises. So even Hollow Knight, the absolute like peak of like indie games, I think, like just loses to Nintendo, and there's just nothing the industry can do to stop it, because there isn't going to be a Hollow Knight 3. There isn't going to be like some major revitalization of this brand of the series. Like you're going to get some DLC over the next couple of years, and that's going to be it. Like we have witnessed the beginning of the end of the corporate indie narrative. Like this is how things are going to end. You can prop up Expedition 33 all you want. You can call it the greatest game ever made. You can call it the game of the year. But at the end of the day, this is something that was absolutely 100% destroyed by Pokemon. This is something that is going to get that cannot compete with Fire Emblem. This is something that is going to wither away into nothing over the next several years. It happened to Yakuza, it happened to Nier Automata, and it's going to happen to this. There is no difference between this and all of the other like fringe games that the industry tried to hype up over the past several years. Expedition 33 is not special. It's not unique. And the simple fact of the matter is, if fans have to talk about the price point and like the budget, and if they're talking about like how it's just like, consumer friendly, it has no DLC. Like, these guys are completely out of touch, because Kirby Air Riders has no DLC either. That game released that like completely finished. And on the flip side, in the Nintendo community, like people are seething about that. you know? Like it's such an interesting like contrast where like, Expedition 33 does something that Nintendo did, and like Nintendo gets criticized for it while Expedition 33 is worshipped. And like again, I do need to reiterate just how performative and fake this all is. Like nothing about Expedition 33 is really organic or natural. And after seeing that award show, I am very, very convinced of that. I think Jennifer English is a stupid whore. I think all those idiots look ridiculous in their stupid berets. I think their millionaire parents really should have invested in like a real career for these people. Like this is, I think, like a very, very good example of how the entire gaming industry just kind of revolves around a lie. The lie that there are good games outside of Nintendo consoles, that there are that there are small passionate developers that put out great games on Xbox, PlayStation, and PC, and this idea that something like this is artsy or invigorating or better than actual RPGs. And that's kind of my takeaway from this, is that like when you look at like my entire list of like games I want to play, like all these different RPGs, like you really start to notice process just how none of these Expedition 33 players know anything about RPGs at all. Like there have been so many good ones over the past 5 years that I've barely been able to keep up with them all. Like Final Fantasy Tactics is like that came out in '97, still better than Expedition 33. Atelier Ryza is just probably one of the best hidden gems of this console generation. You have games like the Dragon Quest 3 remake, or all the Tales of re-releases, or like the old Final Fantasy games. Like you just have so many examples of RPGs that are better than Expedition 33, and yet you're just supposed to sit there and like and say that Expedition 33 is better because the gaming industry told you so, because the gaming YouTuber told you so. No, absolutely not. Like I have seen these people, I've interacted with them. Darkside Phil loves the game. Like I can't take it seriously. Okay, like I play way too many games to take too many RPGs to ever believe what these absolute plebs have to say about my genre. This is a complete and total cope on their part. Expedition 33 will never be successful. It'll never be relevant. It'll never be game of the year. It is not going to save the video game industry. And this recent situation is nothing but a desperate attempt to try and prop up a dying Western video game industry.